Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Lines.
President Trump heads for the top of the mountain. Welcome to the Friday edition as the president gathers his cabinet for a rare televised meeting at Camp David. It just wrapped up and making news on Ukraine, which apparently does not have a formal agreement to make Patriot missiles, as had been suggested. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kailey Lines in Washington. Kailey, we're going to unpack this with General Wesley Clark ahead. This would be pretty significant for the war effort in Ukraine.
Well, certainly so. The president's suggesting you have to be careful with giving away that kind of technology, who you give it to, even after being at the NATO summit in Turkey, where he himself suggested that he wanted to see these licenses go to Ukraine as they continue their fight against Russia. So interesting message from the president, message switching. That is, he was consistent on one other message, though, at his cabinet meeting at Camp David, which is that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. A lot of the same rhetoric we've heard repeatedly from the president on that front.
It's true. After the escalation we've seen this week, Kailey, we talked about it with former Defense Secretary Mark Esper last evening. Oil prices are kicking a bit higher today, and gas prices are following. We're back at $4.10, and this is a thorn in the side of the administration, or frankly anybody running for re-election at the moment. Yeah,
there's a few thorns in the side of this administration. There's also two thorns specifically in the United States Senate, in Senators John Cornyn and Tom Tillis, who are holding up the process over the confirmation of Trump's AG pick, Todd Blanche. It seems that both sides are doubling down today as the president is going on attack against the senators, defending the so-called anti-weaponization fund that they want to see killed in writing. And no surprise, the likes of Tom Tillis are firing back.
Yeah, there was a funny back and forth there with reporters. The president suggested he'd probably do the same thing if he was John Cornyn, but that's just the way people are.
It's the way it works here in Washington, and boy, don't we know it. And as we go from Washington to Wall Street now, we want to kick things off this hour as we turn to Charlie Pellet with a check on the markets on this Friday. Charlie, how are we looking?
Right now, we're higher across the board. Do want to stick with the thorn theme, though, and that is Apple. Yes, we've got stocks rallying today. We are looking at the NASDAQ 100 index. Amazon leading the way higher there after earnings. Amazon shares, by the way, up by 15.2%, but to the downside big time. Apple certainly weighing on that index, on the NASDAQ 100 index. It is the laggard. We've got Apple shares after earnings plunging by 9.7%. The company reported cloud computing revenue, or Amazon reported cloud computing revenue accelerated for a fifth straight quarter. That news sending Amazon up by 15.1%. We did see Apple shares after earnings tumbling by 9.7%. But bottom line, stocks are higher. Let's begin with the NASDAQ 100 index, up 0.6% right now. NASDAQ Composite up 172. That is a gain of 0.7%. S&P up 38 on the S&P 500 index, up 0.5%. Dow Industrials also higher by 0.5%, up by 248 points. The SOX picking up steam, up by 1.3% right now. The VIX below 17. The 10-year 4.73%. The 2-year 4.28%, and the 30-year right now 5.27%. Spot gold at $4,045 the ounce. Right now gold is down 1.4%. Crude up 1.5%. WTI 84.84 a barrel, and Brent right at $90 the barrel. Barrel of Brent crude up by 1.1%. So again, recapping here, we got Amazon rallying. We have got Apple selling off. Bottom line, S&P up by 0.5%. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet with an eye on the Friday trade as we close out the week on Wall Street and here in Washington. Charlie, thank you very much. Of course, it has been a very busy week here in D.C., including this week, the funeral of the late Senator Lindsey Graham that happened on Tuesday. Along with it, the leaders of many countries around the world, multiple heads of state were in town for that, and two of them met with President Trump at the White House while they were in town, including the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who, while it didn't happen publicly before the camera, said afterward that one of the things he discussed with the president is Ukraine's need for Patriot missile systems, interceptors, to help them defend against Russian attacks. Of course, while they need Patriots urgently, there was also an ongoing conversation about them being able to build these systems themselves for licenses to go to Ukraine to produce these in country. We thought that agreement had been made. Trump talked about it at the NATO summit in Turkey just weeks ago. And yet today, he suggested at a cabinet meeting at Camp David that that is not, in fact, a done deal.
We have to be very careful about letting somebody build them. You know, it's very important now. We are building many plants now to make those, and the Tomahawk missile is the most incredible thing. You can go into a doorway, you can put it through a window of a house. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. You have to be very judicious, but you have to be very careful. Now, we have not agreed to that. We're talking about it, but it's a hard thing to give away that kind of technology. Give that technology, they can someday turn on you.
Important development here. We want to get right to Tyler Kendall ahead of our conversation with General Wesley Clark. Our Washington correspondent is at the White House right now on the North Lawn. Tyler, did something change here, or did we misunderstand this arrangement to begin with?
That's an interesting point, Joe. At this point, I think that's one of the questions that we have to pose to the administration, because as you're both outlining, President Trump did pledge on July 8th that the U.S. would be granting these general licenses to allow Ukraine to build these Patriot missile launchers on their own. In fact, that was considered to be perhaps the most tangible development that we had gotten out of the G20 summit earlier this month in Turkey. But this comes after Zelensky was here in Washington meeting with President Trump on Tuesday. In fact, we had reporting that he also met directly with officials from Lockheed Martin about what potential future production would look like, with Ukraine coming out and saying it would take probably up to 10 to 12 months to get that up and running. Now, there is a difference here, as Kailey outlined, between the licenses to build them on their own and actually getting those weapons immediately, as we continue to see these gaps in Ukraine's air defense systems. Though, Joe and Kailey, perhaps Ukraine knew that this was coming, because we have new reporting overnight from Bloomberg News that Ukraine is looking to turn to other allies and reach into their stockpiles of Patriot missiles ahead of the winter months, when we are expecting there to be an increase in attacks as we start to move out of the summer. And then they would look to replenish those allies back with anything that they are able to procure. We did hear from Poland's officials saying earlier this week, after we saw that Russian projectile land in Polish territory, saying that they would be willing to give Ukraine some Patriot missiles.
Well, it sounds, Tyler, like they're getting all the lawn work done at the White House while President Trump is not, in fact, in the residence or in the Oval. He's obviously been dispatched to Camp David, and they're getting the leaf blowers fired up in his absence. When we think more about what we've heard from him at Camp David, though, what we heard in that cabinet meeting, it wasn't just on the subject of Ukraine, but Iran as well, suggesting once again that he's losing patience, losing faith in the negotiators. What does that mean for the diplomatic process?
Well, Kailey, at this point, we heard again that there seems to be these dual tracks. On one hand, he didn't rule out the potential for diplomacy. He gave us a little bit more insight, saying that negotiations were happening at that more senior leadership level. He said that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was involved, as well as his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and also nodded to the Vice President, J.D. Vance. Yet at the same time, he said that we should expect further strikes on Iran to continue, calling them acting in bad faith, saying that they haven't upheld their part of the deal after we really saw the latest lull in the fighting re-escalate earlier this week when Iran issued that surprise attack against U.S. forces. At this point, there has been very little public indication that the sides are getting any closer toward a diplomatic breakthrough, considering Iran isn't letting up its leverage when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, the biggest point of contention at this moment, as we've seen Iran new overnight turning around at least 6 vessels that were transiting through the U.S. coordinated route, and not that Iranian route that the IRGC is overseeing, just further heightening the tensions in the region.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall on the North Lawn of the White House, a North Lawn that probably is going to have fewer leaves scattered on it. Tyler, thank you very much. And as we continue the conversation on both Iran and Ukraine, we turn now to General Wesley Clark, who is joining us once again on Bloomberg TV and radio. He's, of course, a retired 4-star general in the U.S. Army and served as commander of U.S. Southern Command. General, it's great to have you back on Balance of Power. I'll quote the president from earlier today to you directly. He says, "We'll be hitting them very hard," referring to Iran, "and at some point they'll say, we just can't take it anymore." What makes them reach that point?
You know, most of the experts on the region, and I've been with the region off and on and in various roles for 25 years, most of the people don't believe you're going to get a capitulation from the Iranians. They've taken the punch. The IRGC has survived it. They lost their top leadership. They've still got their missile cities intact. Pickaxe Mountain, which is president's talked about, is intact. And so you could take out oil refineries. Most of their water is not from desalination. You can tear down some bridges. But if the idea is that you would punish them enough that they would say, oh my gosh, I just can't take one more punch in the nose, most of the people who really understand it say that's not likely to happen because you're dealing with real zealots. And let me put it this way. Look at what the Ukrainians have taken over the last 4.5 years from the Russians. And you would have said, my goodness, how could they stand it? Well, because for the Iranians, like for the Ukrainians, this is an existential battle. The president announced early on that we were looking at regime change. He's a couple of times suggested he was going to blow them back to the Stone Age. So they take those comments seriously. They see it as existential. I'm not talking about the Iranian people now. I'm talking about the IRGC. They're hanging on for dear life. And so if you knock out a few more bridges and take out a couple of oil refineries and so forth and reduce their money flow, okay. But they think they're winning right now. And they think they're going to continue to hold the Strait of Hormuz, strike our friends and allies in the Gulf, drive us back out of military positions there and back into the arms of Israel, and then by that time have sufficient missile strength to simply launch 1,000 missiles at Israel. Israel expends all its anti-missile ordnance, and that's the end of it. And the longer this goes on, the greater the support they're getting from China and Russia. So I don't think you can punch them in the nose and get them to surrender. But we've got to find a better way, I think.
General, what do you make of the trip to Camp David today? We carried the president's cabinet meeting, a rare Camp David cabinet meeting, and a rare visit there in general for this president who tends to not go to the top of the mountain very often. But we know that Camp David is typically or has been reserved for delicate conversations, for sensitive negotiations, for deliberations away from the public eye. Knowing there was a TV camera there, which was a bit unusual to see today, I wonder if this cabinet meeting took place because the president was there to speak quietly with his top lieutenants. He's got Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and others up there with him about next steps and potentially escalating this war.
Well, I think the administration, I think the president recognizes he's at a crucial decision point here. He's tried 5 weeks of airstrikes. He's tried to pause and ask for negotiations. Negotiations were undertaken. There was an MOU, and it wasn't very well written, and it was violated immediately by the Iranians, who didn't open the Strait of Hormuz. And then there's been tit for tat, and now surprise attacks and response. And I think the administration recognizes this is a fork in the road. If the more you want negotiations with the Iranians, the stronger hand they believe they have, and the worse the outcome of the negotiations will be. So do you continue to be the demandeur of the negotiations? Do you apply force? But if you apply force, what targets do you go after? And so there's some speculation that maybe we do one more round of really heavy airstrikes, a couple of weeks, take out all the remaining targets that we have in a 14,000 target base, refineries, bridges, everything that we think is significant, probably hit a couple of empty warehouses along the way. And then at that point, you're going to have to go in on the ground. At least that's the thinking. And that's one of the strands of thought that's hanging out there. So you're at a real inflection point here. And the question is, which way do we go? And if we move forward without isolating Iran from reinforcement, supplies, technology, targeting, and all the other assistance from Iran, China, and some of it coming through Pakistan, we're in for a long, tough fight.
Well, that's incredible to consider as we consider the fight directly between the U.S. and Iran. There's also the questions of the conflicts that have been going on in parallel with it in many ways, including, of course, with Hezbollah, between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then there was the question of Gaza as well. The president announced yesterday, General, that the Board of Peace has reached an agreement for the complete disarmament of Hamas, that the president says, to use his words, will be a monumental step toward lasting peace and security. How much faith would you put in it?
Well, this is, I think it's a triumph of hope over reality. I'd be very surprised if Hamas would agree to that. And certainly if they're getting any help from Iran or through Hezbollah, I'd be doubtful that they'd agree to it. It's been a tremendous, tremendous burden on Israel, not only from the military side, but also from the public relations side and international support side, as Israel has struggled to deal with the terrorist organization. So it'll be in the interest of all the outside actors who are opposed to Israel to tell Hamas, don't disarm, drag this thing on, take another month, 2 months, 3 months. So the problem with disarmaments is always, how do you actually do it and then verify it? And then that's, until you see the fine details, you don't know whether it's going to be real or not.
I want to ask you about the president's comments today about Ukraine, General. We didn't think we'd be talking about this, but he's casting doubt, in fact, openly doubting this deal to provide general licenses for Ukraine to build its own Patriot missiles. He said, we have to be very careful about giving out the secrets to those weapons. There's a risk of giving it away and them turning on you. Did you understand that this was a deal in place? And without those Patriots, what next for Ukraine?
President Zelensky has asked for just a few Patriots. He said he wants 30 before he gets into the winter, or maybe a little bit more than that. And really, we have been withholding these because we have a shortfall. So it's natural that we would allow someone else to manufacture. Okay, if you don't trust Ukraine, give it to Poland, give it to Britain, give it to somebody. Under the Defense Production Act, the president could have that authority. So, and the idea that the Patriots would be turned against us, I'm not sure about that. Actually, it looks like the more effective missile than the Patriot is a French-Italian anti-aircraft missile that's been around for a few years, continuously updated. And while some of the Iranian missiles can slip through the Patriots, we think this French-Italian missile won't let the steerable Iranian missiles or Russian missiles through. So it might be more effective. And Ukraine is going to develop its own anti-aircraft missiles or anti-missile missiles very quickly if we don't allow them to do it. They've already got their own TLAM. They've all long-range cruise missile. They're testing their ballistic missiles that would be able to hit Moscow. So let's get real here. We're moving into a situation where we're going to have at least 2 interlocking and perhaps 3 interlocking global crises, all with military force, in which they're engaged with Iran bridging between the Middle East and Ukraine, Russia supporting Iran as well as attacking Ukraine, China feeding both Russia and Iran to fight the United States. Yeah. So this is not a skirmish. This is a real serious inflection point in U.S. power abroad. We've got to handle it.
General Wesley Clark, it's great to have you back. Retired 4-star U.S. Army. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kailey Lines. This is Bloomberg. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts, and listen anytime at our website. It's Bloomberg.com.
Time is short. There's only 1 week left until the Senate leaves for its elongated August recess. That, of course, happens every year, and there's a lot that they're trying to get done before they actually break for recess this time around. It's not clear whether or not that will include confirming Todd Blanche to be the next Attorney General of the United States. He, of course, was Deputy AG. He is now Acting AG. And it's unclear whether or not he's going to remain in that acting capacity for some time. The president has threatened, as of yesterday, to pull his formal nomination and allow him to serve as acting for the time being, or at very least until Senators Cornyn and Tillis are out of office, because they are the ones that are standing in the way here over specifically the so-called anti-weaponization fund and the audit immunity deal that was secured for the president. And his businesses as part of it. The president seems to double down on that on True Social today, and again in the cabinet meeting at Camp David. On True Social, he suggests that the fund needed to go to, quote, great American patriots. He says perhaps there has never been a group of people treated so badly in our nation's history. And that doesn't sit well necessarily with one of the senators in question, Senator Thom Tillis, reposting that on X to say the president made it clear today that the so-called anti-weaponization fund is still alive, which is exactly why we are attempting to formally end it. He says those who assaulted police officers on January 6 are not great American patriots who are victims of government abuse, Joe.
So I guess it's going to be an acting attorney general for the foreseeable future. They met just yesterday. It was
Todd
said
Blanche
to be a pretty good meeting, so I don't quite understand where this is going.
What's incredible is that Thom Tillis consistently says that they've been working with Blanche and
That's
that
right.
Blanche is not the problem. In his X post, he says Blanche has been forthright, thoughtful, and patient. It's a shame his confirmation, I'm quoting Senator Tillis directly, has hit a snag only because an incompetent personal advisor to the president refuses to amend the bogus settlement.
That's always the tack. It's the people around the president
Right.
when you talk to Thom Tillis. Let's see what our panel thinks. Jeanne is back with us today. Jeanne Zaino, our Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst, and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, alongside Wesley, a Republican strategist, president, Rising Communications fellow at the Atlantic Council. Leslie, should Todd Blanche get comfortable with this acting title? We heard the president articulate the same spirit of that post in the cabinet meeting today. This is a deal breaker, right?
I mean, I think it's really unfortunate because Todd Blanche is incredibly qualified. He's incredibly experienced. You know, he's been doing the job. He's proven that he will be a fantastic attorney general. So I would really like to see him get fully confirmed. I know that he would too. And you have to keep in mind that there are some limitations that are placed on acting rather than fully confirmed attorneys general. So, you know, the quicker that we can get him confirmed, I think the better.
Well, so who is it that needs to blink here then, Leslie? Is it Mr. Blanche? Is it the White House? Is it these senators?
I think that's the great question here, right? Look, President Trump is by far the most popular, most powerful person in the Republican Party. So he has this capability to contact senators and to, you know, lobby them hard to find out what it is that he needs to do in order to get his attorney general across the finish line. You know, I think that he's going to be frustrated about having to do this, but at the end of the day, getting Todd Blanche fully confirmed will be a huge victory for the Trump administration. And so I think he should try to work with the Senate to get that done.
What's going on here, Jeanne? Is the DOJ aware of the president's feelings on this? Because they were said to be making progress.
Yeah, I think they are. And I think we should take a step back and look at what is going on here. Is that the president is unwilling to allow Todd Blanche to put something in writing that he confirmed during his confirmation hearings that this weaponization fund, or anti-weaponization fund as it's called, is in fact dead. And as Thom Tillis said today, the language of the president on Truth Social this morning, in the cabinet meeting today, as he waxed poetical and with great concern over the January 6th people who raided the Congress, who raided the legislature on Capitol Hill on January 6th, were convicted, many of them put in jail and then pardoned by the president. He's very concerned that they were maltreated. And yet, what is this really about? This is because the president of the United States wants a deal that no other American can ever get, which is immunity from past and future IRS investigation for him and his family. Of course, he already enjoys immunity as president. He wants that for his family. As we sit here recognizing the 250th anniversary of the United States, I think we should all remember that this is the stuff of kings and monarchs. It is not the stuff in a democracy of an executive leader. And that's why this corruption is at an extraordinary level. And the idea that he's willing to throw Todd Blanche over the bus is astonishing. And of course, his plan to do it in January hinges on a lot of things, including who takes the Senate and who's on the Judiciary Committee come the next Congress. He doesn't know what that's going to look like, and Todd Blanche may end up as acting until the rest of his term. Well,
and I guess the question becomes whether or not if it's not to be Todd Blanche, Leslie, any other future nominee is going to have this same problem, because what they're trying to extract is not necessarily just a promise from Blanche. It is from the Department of Justice. So anyone tapped to run the DOJ, to be the top of the DOJ, I would imagine is going to face the very same thing, if not from Cornyn and Tillis, potentially from Democrats who have the majority, or from other more moderate Republican senators.
And I mean, you're making the exact right point, and Jeanne made the right point too, right? Which is, we don't know what the Senate will look like next year. I think Republicans will absolutely retain control of the Senate, but we don't know who will be on Judiciary Committee. We don't know how much we will have control of the Senate. And on top of that, this isn't about Blanche. They've made it clear it is about this, weaponization fund and the IRS issue, and they're going to hold on to that through the end of this Congress. So, to me, I think the president is a notoriously good deal maker. He makes deals. I think he should reach out directly, use his considerable sway within the party, figure out what he can do to get them to a yes, and then do it.
Interesting to watch this cabinet meeting, Jeanne, because we saw Jay Clayton in the room, the president's new DNI, although I guess he's not actually, because he's not been sworn in, right? Bill Pulte was also at the other end of the table. He's got Pulte on the same side of the table as the president of the United States. And it was floated, as we, I think, discussed yesterday, that, well, maybe that's one way to unstick this whole thing. President Trump does it again. He puts Bill Pulte in as acting attorney general. See how bad you want Todd Blanche on a day like that. You see a maneuver like that coming?
My goodness, I hope not. And so I guess Bill Pulte will be the person you put in as being so unqualified and objectionable that anybody is better. I can't imagine he goes in as acting attorney general, but I've seen everything if he does. But we know that he is reportedly, according to at least Politico, wants to stay in the post of acting DNI as long as possible. And it looks as if today that he is. You got to feel a little bit bad for both Jay Clayton sitting there and Todd Blanche. Jay Clayton, who got confirmed and is just waiting to be allowed to take the post and wondering where his predecessor as acting is going to land, because he's certainly not going to go very far away.
Well, Jay Clayton being confirmed was supposed to be, even if I guess there wasn't necessarily the stipulation that he also had to be sworn in and Bill Pulte had to be out, but I guess that's probably what Democrats were hoping to see. Wasn't this supposed to unlock, at long last, the reauthorization of FISA Section 702? Jeanne, are we going to see that before the recess? It doesn't seem so. It doesn't seem like there's really any urgency around it on either side, frankly.
I agree totally with that, Kailey. I think that there's not a lot of urgency to get FISA done at this point, and I don't see the Senate moving in that direction. I think that was the talking point before Clayton's nomination was confirmed, but since we haven't heard a lot about it, because of course the Senate has so much else on its desk before they go on this recess, much of which involves fighting with the White House, whether it's the Save America Act, whether it's the Todd Blanche nomination, so much. And of course, John Thune at the center of it all. So I think FISA, if we get it, I think it's going to probably be after the midterm. I hope it gets done. We need it, particularly at a time when we are at war. But I don't think there's much energy in that direction, at least in the next, few hours as we're looking at it now.
Hey, Leslie, what do you think about this Bill Pulte situation? Typically, you're confirmed by the Senate. They swear you in a couple of hours later. You're a photo op. You're out having dinner with your new colleagues. Spectacularly bizarre is how Senator Ron Wyden describes the fact that Bill Pulte's hanging on there for longer. Senator Mark Warner called it amazing in a horrible way. It's baffling. What's the president doing here?
I mean, I don't think it's really that uncommon to have somebody that's been working in a role to stick around for a week or two and try to help the new incoming person. That's usually a really good way to transition, instead of having one person out the door immediately, having him there. You could still
swear in the new guy, couldn't you?
Pardon?
You could still swear in the new guy, couldn't you, though? they'll
I'm
work
not
together
sure
to
why
make
they
the
haven't
transition.
sworn him in yet. It would make sense to go ahead and do that. It could just be perhaps the president is traveling. He wants to be the one to swear him in. He wants to be there. There could be a myriad of reasons as to why they haven't sworn him in yet. I don't think it's nefarious. I think the president is very excited about having Jay Clayton come in. I'm certain that Bill Pulte would love to stay because, look, I can tell you from personal experience, working in foreign policy and national security is really fun. It's really interesting. But I think that we're all ready to get Jay Clayton in there, and having a little bit of a transition will only help.
All right, Leslie Shed and Jeanne Zaino, our political panel on this Friday. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
95 days to the midterm elections. Pretty remarkable as we consider the markets that we're looking at here and the impact of inflation. The issue of affordability is something that's following candidates all over the country. And with interest rates on the rise, we're looking at the 30-year at now 5.27. It's pretty interesting to see stocks holding up to the extent that they are because oil prices are higher too, and that helps to increase interest rates. All of this leading to a conversation about inflation that our colleague David Weston has this evening at 6 p.m. Eastern with Jason Furman, the professor of practice, Harvard Kennedy School, former NEC director in the Obama administration, about the root cause of this inflation, whether it's the war in Iran or something more broad. Listen.
That's what the Fed is trying to figure out right now. And there's a few mechanisms for that. Some of it is direct, just the cost of jet fuel goes up, so airplane tickets go up. That's not the biggest concern. The big concern is if it gets built into expectations, and the way that manifests itself is economy-wide wage setting and economy-wide price setting. So if you see prices go up faster and that leads to wages going up faster, and wages going up faster leads to prices going up faster, and you end up with a sort of persistent cycle. That is so far where I am cautiously optimistic. We're not seeing the wage growth commensurate with this type of inflationary economy, again, in the way that we saw it a couple of years ago. But that is where we would see the broadening out if it really starts to show up, not just in specific prices, but across the board prices, and especially in wages.
Do the numbers coming out of the labor market cut both ways? There was a time not too long ago, there was a lot of concern on the Fed that, in fact, there was a loosening of the labor market. We needed to really keep rates low for that reason. That does not appear to be true now. It's more stable now than it was 6-9 months ago. Does that give the Fed actually some license to increase to address the inflation question?
Yeah, it absolutely does. The Fed has two mandates. The employment mandate right now is in better shape than I can almost ever remember. Normally, the unemployment rate is either too high and it's coming down, or maybe it's too low and it's rising quickly, or something like that. It's just been amazingly stable. It peaked in November of last year. It's fallen a bit since then. It's basically the same place for the last 2.5 years. And it's not clear what would dislodge that unless there was some big exogenous shock to the economy, say the AI bubble burst. And I don't think there's any reason to expect that to happen anytime soon. So yeah, the Fed really just needs to worry about the one side of its mandate right now, which is inflation.
The former NEC director, Jason Furman, in conversation with our colleague David Weston, the host of Wall Street Week, which, of course, airs tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And while Mr. Furman says that the Fed really needs to focus on the one side of the mandate, the inflation side, there is the labor market question as well. And we're going to get our latest read on that next week with Jobs Day, of course, coming up on Friday. It's just one of the many calendar items on what is shaping up to be a pretty busy week. And it'll be a busy one in politics as well. Tuesday, especially, is its primary day across a number of states. But the one we will all be watching is Michigan, where the Democratic Senate primary is hotly contested and could give us a signal as to what direction the party is going. It's, of course, Abdul El-Sayed, who's a progressive, who the Democratic Socialists are campaigning for, even if he says he's not formally part of it, versus the establishment-backed Congresswoman Haley Stevens. And the latest poll out from Emerson College has Haley Stevens down 15 points to El-Sayed at this point. And Emerson's director of polling, Spencer Kimball, is joining us once again on Bloomberg TV and radio. Spencer, welcome back to Balance of Power. This number raised a lot of eyebrows, a 15-point gap in a race that a lot of people have said is pretty tight, could be a nail biter. So is he just going to run away with this and surprise people?
Well, we're going to see on Tuesday night, Kailey, if it is going to be a nail biter. But the data suggests that Saeed has been able to build a coalition of younger voters, particularly under 50, and been able to make inroads with educated voters. And that coalition looks to be a pretty successful recipe here in the Democratic primary.
Well, I'll tell you, watching these numbers evolve is incredible. The way you present numbers from January, April, and July. El Sayed goes 16% up to 24%, now at 54%, and it's been a little bit less optimistic for Haley Stevens. She was in the teens back in January. She's at 39% now, and I'm sure that you've heard people call this poll an outlier. I was talking to a Democratic campaign operative here in Washington, D.C. last evening who was apoplectic about this poll. You've probably been hearing from some of them. What has happened in the last month or two to justify this huge increase in support?
Well, there was another candidate in the race, Mallory McMorrow, and she was polling pretty well in our numbers in April, and she drops out of the race. And the idea there was that her vote would go to one of the two candidates, Stevens or El Sayed.
Yes, now we know.
It looks like that vote has essentially split itself, not really coalescing around one of the two candidates. And because of that, El Sayed's been able to maintain that edge he's had over Stevens in all of our polling, really since April. In January, we had Stevens a little bit higher, but she's been struggling in our numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and of course, she is backed by the establishment and has establishment Democrats like the one Joe was speaking with apoplectic, because the concern is that she's the one who would be able to beat Mike Rogers in the general, and that he would potentially be the victor in the other scenario. And I wonder, Spencer, if that's what your polling bears out.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because we saw that come across the newswire this week, that general election polling that had the two Democrats against Mike Rogers. What was interesting in there is that they didn't measure the primary, which is this week. And that kind of raised an eyebrow from the Stevens camp that why wouldn't you put out that primary number unless it's not a good number? And the better number to look at would be the general election. We see this all the time with viability. We talked about President Trump. Is he a viable candidate back in 2016 for general elections? It's what the campaigns will use to try to find a message to move the needle in their direction. I'm not sure it's going to be enough here for Stevens.
Do you have head-to-head numbers for a general election?
We haven't pulled a head-to-head since January, which we had it as a tight race as well with El Sayed.
Yeah.
But that's been 7-8 months ago.
The fact of the matter is, if your name is Mike Rogers, you're just hanging out listening to this interview, enjoying every minute of it, right?
Well, I'm not so sure Mike Rogers has got this thing in the bag. I know the Democrats are fighting right now, and it's divisive, but you know, it's kind of like on the other side down in Texas, the Republicans, with Tellerico, everybody tries to line up their opponents thinking, oh, maybe Paxton would be easier than Cornyn. Here in Michigan, maybe El Sayed would be easier than Haley. But at the end of the day, I think after the primaries, the candidates, they'll work together. The divisiveness usually, fades away, and we'll see a coalition build. So I don't put too much stake into that at this time.
Well, as we consider the dynamics for November, regardless of who wins, how high will the conversion rate be among Democrats if their preferred candidate in the primary loses to then go out and vote for the person who is victorious in the general? Or is there a likelihood of lower participation in that scenario?
Yeah, that enthusiasm gap is something that we're going to keep an eye on. But it looks like the Democrats are really going to rally around whoever the nominees are, because they're the party out of power. And generally, that's what we see. But don't forget, in 22, we had some races for the Republicans in Pennsylvania, Arizona, that ended up not going in their direction because of candidate quality. So we'll see, obviously, who gets these nominations. But then let's reset the race in September, and we'll give you some fresh numbers at that point.
Would love to move to South Carolina and the numbers that you have on the special Republican primary for U.S. Senate. This is, of course, the seat that was held by the late Senator Lindsey Graham. Got to be honest here, Spencer. I'm surprised Darlene Graham is not first. Ralph Norman is at 22%, followed by Graham at 19%, Russell Fry at 12%, Mark Sanford at 11%. Darlene Graham does not have a name recognition issue, right? What does this say about her chances in Ralph Norman's candidacy?
I guess some would call it another outlier, but we're just looking at our reality here. And we've done this poll now twice. We did it 2 weeks ago as a hypothetical. And now that the candidates are in there, remember, this race is in a week. South Carolina has a truncated process here where if nobody gets to 50% on August 11th, there's going to be a runoff on August 25th. So this is all happening really fast. And it looks like Lindsey Graham's sister, who is now the senator, is struggling to get name recognition and viability come the general election. And we saw South Carolina not necessarily line up with the Trump endorsement in the gubernatorial race. We're going to see what happens here in this Senate special election. And in South Carolina, you were talking about the economy. We just looked at those Republican voters, and they're blaming President Trump for the high gas prices. And that's something that the Republicans are going to be concerned about coming to these midterms. They're still blaming President Biden for grocery store prices, but those gas prices that are hitting the wallets, that might become a bigger issue. So we learned that as well out of South Carolina.
Well, you mentioned the gubernatorial race, which Ralph Norman, of course, ran in, although he didn't come close to winning it. But how much of his numbers could be carryover from the name recognition that he was already on the ballot?
Well, Mark Lynch was carrying that. You can see he's the fifth guy on the list. He's the one who ran against Graham last time and got 28%. He's now down to 7%. So you can see name recognition goes in both directions. But yeah, I do think Norman does benefit from that early stages at this point. But again, it's only a week until, 2 weeks until the election. It's going to take a lot of effort to increase name rec. And what's interesting is Graham's sister already has Trump's endorsement. So is Trump going to come to South Carolina? It's going to be really interesting to watch the dynamics of that race play out.
You might have seen the memo from Doug Sosnick, Spencer. Pretty interesting. He's predicting a blue wave election, citing the party's overperformance in elections over the past year or two, the president's all-time low approval numbers, economic dissatisfaction, the war in Iran. Is he on the right track?
Yeah, our national generic ballot test has had the Democrats up by double digits for a few months. That tells me it's kind of baked in, that 10, 11-point spread. And that's a very large spread when we think about historically where we see these generic ballot test numbers. And that's why the Democrats are a little bullish in Ohio, in Texas, in Alaska, because now if those numbers get to double digits, states that look to be out of play come into play, and there you could have that blue tsunami that people are looking for. I think the House is one story. We'll obviously have to wait. As I mentioned, the candidate quality in the Senate is going to play a factor in those races, more so than in those House races.
Just quickly, Spencer, as we talked about the Republican primary in South Carolina, is there a remote chance that actually doesn't stay a Republican seat?
I guess there is a remote chance. The Democrats have put up a strong candidate, but this is South Carolina. It's going to be Lindsey Graham's seat. But I can tell you from looking at the data that there is definitely concerns about the Trump administration, and having that connection to the administration is a plus and a minus for these Republican candidates, because you need that Trump endorsement, generally speaking, in the primaries. But come the general election, that could end up having an impact. Remember when Lindsey Graham ran against Jamie Harrison, a couple cycles ago, that was supposed to be competitive, but Graham still win by 10 points. So hard to think.
Hey, Spencer, it's good to have you back. Spencer Kimball, director of the Emerson College Polling Center. Regards to my alma mater. We'll meet you on the late edition of Balance of Power. Kailey will be here with myself, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg.